To the world, he was Little Stevie, the smiling 12-year-old genius with the harmonica. But behind the dark glasses was a child star trapped in a golden cage. Motown didn't just manage him, they owned him. Treating his blindness as a novelty act and controlling every dime he earned, the label turned a prodigy into a profitable puppet. Handlers stand just off stage, watching his every move. He is led around by the hand like a prop. His posture screams terrified obedience. This desperation for control did not begin in a recording studio. It began in a hospital ward in Saginaw, Michigan, on May 13, 1950. Steveland Hardaway Judkins was born 6 weeks premature. In the mid-20th century, segregated hospitals often compromised care for black infants. Doctors placed Stevie in an incubator to aid his breathing, a glass box designed to save his life. Instead, it sealed his fate. A physician made a catastrophic error in the machine's calibration, pumping oxygen levels too high. This created a toxic environment that triggered retinopathy of prematurity. The excess oxygen caused the blood vessels behind his eyes to grow wildly, creating fibrous scar tissue that detached his retinas. Stevie Wonder had sight when he was born. The technology meant to save him took his vision. This medical error created the defining parameter of his existence. He navigated the world not through images, but through vibrations, tones, and echoes. By age 4, the family moved to Detroit, not to the rhythm and blues capital, but to poverty. His mother, Lula Mae Hardaway, faced the overwhelming burden of raising a disabled black child in a segregated city. The physical world of the Detroit projects was a landscape of hazards for a blind child. Stevie's world contracted to the interior of his home. He banged on spoons, tabletops, and pans to assert his presence in the void. By age 9, he was a one-man percussion section, mimicking the R&B stations filtering through the thin apartment walls. This was survival, not just art. Hearing was his only connection to the stream of life outside his dark room. The adjective little was a brand, signaling to the audience that he was small, harmless, and permanent child. Motown then made a calculated instrumentation choice. Stevie was a prodigy on the piano, a dignified instrument that commands authority. Motown pushed the harmonica. A blind boy playing the piano looks like a musician. A blind boy thrashing his head back and forth while blowing into a harmonica looks like a spectacle. It is kinetic, visual, and borders on the comedic. They dressed him in oversized plaid suits and encouraged his natural blindisms. The rocking back and forth, the rolling of the head. An ethical manager would have trained these habits out of a performer. Motown leaned into them. They wanted the audience to stare. They marketed the disability as the primary attraction. The strategy worked with devastating efficiency. In 1963, Motown released Fingertips, capturing the raw, frantic energy of a live performance. It went to number 1. The Little Stevie brand was validated. Motown had their proof. The gimmick sold records. This success trapped him. For the next several years, the label forced him to replicate Fingertips, demanding more harmonica instrumentals and shouting records. While Stevie listened to the Beatles and Bob Dylan, absorbing the complex musical landscape of the mid-60s, Motown treated him as a novelty act, closer to a ventriloquist than a serious recording artist. He was the mascot, the energy shot, the circus trick used to warm up the crowd for the serious acts. He was trapped in a cage of gold and applause, playing the role of the happy dancing child while the man inside began to scream for release. By 1964, the trap was set. The Fingertips phenomenon had proven to Motown that the gimmick worked, and they had no intention of changing the formula. While the public saw a smiling child, Prodigy waving to crowds from the steps of airplanes, The reality inside the Motown machine was a grinding, daily humiliation. To understand the depth of the resentment that fueled the 1971 rebellion, we must step away from the stage lights and look at the ledger, the tour bus, and the lonely hotel rooms where Stevland Morris spent his teenage years. The most damning evidence of this exploitation lies in the finances. By the mid-1960s, Stevie Wonder was a global brand. He was touring Europe, appearing in Hollywood beach party movies, and selling millions of records. The gross revenue generated by the Little Stevie entity was astronomical. It was enough to help finance the expansion of the entire Motown empire. Yet every week the artist himself was handed an allowance that would have been insulting to a factory worker, let alone a superstar: $2.50. This was not a clerical error. It was a policy. The trust fund established by the contract was a black box. Motown's accountants operated with a level of creative deduction that bordered on theft. Under the terms of the guardianship, the label was entitled to deduct reasonable expenses before depositing any royalties into Stevie's future account. Motown defined reasonable with appalling latitude. They deducted the cost of the recording sessions. They deducted the cost of the glittery suits Stevie despised but was forced to wear. They deducted the travel expenses for his handlers. They deducted the food he ate. Essentially, Stevie was paying the salaries of his own jailers. He was financing his own captivity. The indignity extended to his mother, Lula Mae Hardaway. Here was the mother of America's boy wonder, a woman whose son was keeping the lights on at Hitsville, USA. Yet she was still living in relative poverty in Detroit. There are records of Lula having to schedule appointments with Motown executives, hat in hand, to beg for advances on her son's money to pay for basic necessities like heating bills or winter coats for her other children. The executives would smile, pat her hand, and grant her a small loan against the trust, reinforcing the power dynamic. We own the money. You survive because we allow it. This constant financial anxiety kept the family compliant. A wealthy artist has the power to say no. A desperate family does what they are told. But if the financial control was a cage, life on the road was solitary confinement. The Motortown Revue was legendary, a caravan of buses crisscrossing the American landscape, carrying the greatest assembly of black talent in history. For the adults, the Supremes, the Temptations, Marvin Gaye, it was a chaotic, liberated life of parties, romances, and rock and roll. For a 12-year-old blind boy, it was a rolling prison. Stevie was isolated by his age and his disability. Motown viewed him as a logistical liability. They couldn't let him wander, they couldn't let him get hurt, so they assigned him a warden. His name was Ted Hull. On the payroll, Hull was listed as a private tutor, a graduate of Michigan State University hired to ensure Stevie received a high school education. In reality, Hull was the filter through which Stevie experienced the world. For nearly a decade, Hull was Stevie's eyes. He controlled the schedule. He controlled the environment. Imagine the psychology of this existence. You wake up in a different hotel room every morning. You cannot see the city outside. You cannot read the signs. You rely entirely on one man to tell you where you are, what is happening, and when to sleep. If Ted Hull said it was unsafe to go out, Stevie stayed in. If Hull said it was night, it was night. This created a profound learned helplessness. Stevie wasn't just an employee, he was a ward of the state of Motown, a boy in a bubble who was paraded out to perform and then packed away in a box until the next show. As the years ground on, a new threat emerged: biology. In 1966, Stevie turned 16. The little boy began to die. His body stretched out, becoming tall and gangly. But the true crisis was his voice, the high-pitched, exuberant yelp that had driven fingertips cracked and dropped, settling into a deepening baritone. In the entertainment industry, puberty is usually the time of death for a child star. The cute factor evaporates. You cannot market a 6-foot-tall man with a mustache as a little boy blue. Panic set in at the Motown executive offices. Sales dipped. The gimmick was over. There were closed-door meetings where top executives seriously discussed dropping Stevie from the label. They whispered that he was washed up, a one-hit wonder who had outgrown his usefulness. To save his career, Berry Gordy decided to domesticate him. If he couldn't be a cute child, he had to become a safe adult entertainer. They modeled him after Sammy Davis Jr., someone who would wear a tuxedo, smile broadly, and sing non-threatening pop standards for white supper clubs. They forced him into the studio to record an album of covers. They made him sing The Shadow of Your Smile, Ebb Tide, and other easy listening standards. It was a humiliating attempt to strip away his soulfulness and replace it with polish. They were trying to turn a musical revolutionary into a cabaret singer. Stevie hated it. He felt the falseness of it in his bones. But he had no leverage. He was a minor, he was broke, and he was terrified of being dropped. So he put on the tuxedo. He smiled. He sang the songs he hated. However, Motown made a critical miscalculation. They assumed that because Stevie was blind, he was oblivious. They assumed that because he was quiet, he was content. They didn't realize that the isolation of the blind world had given him a superpower, the ability to listen. While the executives were debating his marketing strategy, Stevie was listening to the radio. He was absorbing the psychedelic rock of the Beatles, the folk poetry of Bob Dylan, and the radical funk of Sly and the Family Stone. He was hearing a revolution in music, and he knew he could be part of it. Late at night, after the handlers had gone to bed or were busy partying, Stevie began to sneak back into the Hitsville studio. He befriended the engineers. He asked questions. What does this knob do? How do you create that echo? How do I splice this tape? Because he couldn't see the mixing board, he memorized it by touch. He learned the geometry of the console. He began to experiment with drums, playing with a heavy syncopated funk that was miles away from the polished Motown sound. He was secretly building a skill set that no other artist on the label possessed. He wasn't just learning to sing, he was learning to produce. He was seizing the means of production in the dark. Simultaneously, a political awakening was taking place. The late 1960s was a time of fire in America. The civil rights movement was shifting from the nonviolence of Dr. King to the militant power of the Black Panthers. The Detroit riots of 1967 burned blocks of the city to the ground. Stevie was a young black man traveling through the heart of this conflict. On the tour bus in the Deep South, he heard the racial slurs hurled at them. He felt the tension when the police pulled the bus over. He smelled the smoke of the riots. He was living in the crosshairs of history. He wanted to write about it. He wanted to scream about it. He wanted to use his voice to reflect the pain and anger of his people. But Motown operated on a strict policy of crossover appeal. They were in the business of selling black music to white teenagers in the suburbs. Politics was bad for business. An angry black man didn't sell records. So when Stevie brought in lyrics that touched on social issues, the producers handed him songs about sugar and spice. They forced a cognitive dissonance upon him that was maddening. He had to stand on stage and perform joy while his heart was breaking for his country. He was being asked to deny his own blackness for the sake of the bottom line. It was during this period of intense frustration that he met Syreeta Wright. She was a secretary at Motown who was also an aspiring songwriter. Syreeta was different. She didn't treat him like a child or a commodity. She treated him like a man and an intellectual equal. She became his window to the wider world. She read to him books on philosophy, religion, and the poetry of the Black Arts movement. She discussed the Vietnam War with him. She validated his feelings of anger. Sarita became the catalyst for his maturity. Through her love and her intellect, Stevie realized that the protection Motown offered was actually suppression. He realized that he wasn't just a singer. He was a vessel for something much larger. By 1969, the dynamic had shifted, though Motown didn't see it yet. Stevie stopped arguing. He stopped asking for permission to change his songs. He retreated into a calculated silence. To the executives, it looked like compliance. They thought, good, the boy is finally settling down. They gave him a hit song, signed, sealed, delivered, I'm yours, and he sang it with gusto. They thought the title was a promise of loyalty. In reality, the silence was a strategy. Stevie had done the math. He knew the date, May 13th, 1971. He knew that on that day, the signature of Lula Mae Hardaway would expire. He knew that the contract that bound him was voidable. He began to live a double life. By day, he was the smiling Motown star, recording the hits they wanted. By night, he was planning the heist. He began to save every penny of his meager allowance. He began to secretly tape his new musical ideas, strange, complex electronic sounds, and hide the tapes where Motown couldn't find them. He was like a prisoner digging a tunnel with a spoon, hiding the dirt in his pockets, smiling at the warden every morning. The golden cage was still locked, but the prisoner had found the key. He just had to wait for the right moment to turn it. The year 1970 would be a year of deception, a year of gathering strength, and a year of preparing for the explosion that would shatter the windows of Hitsville, USA forever. The freak show was closing down. The revolution was about to begin. By 1970, the pieces of the conspiracy were moving into place. But to the outside world, and specifically to the executives at Motown, Stevie Wonder appeared to be the model employee. He was 20 years old, a global superstar, and he was churning out hits. He had just released Signed, Sealed, Delivered, I'm Yours, a track that spent 6 weeks at #1 on the R&B charts. On the surface, the song was a celebration of devotion, a promise of loyalty. The executives in Detroit heard the lyrics and nodded in approval. They believed the Wonder Boy was finally settling into his role as a reliable adult hitmaker. They saw the smile, the energy, and the sales figures, and they exhaled. They assumed the rebellious phase was over. They were wrong. The song was not a promise, it was a diversion. While Motown was distracted by the profits, Stevie was quietly assembling a war council. He knew that talent alone would not be enough to break the ironclad contract his mother had signed. He needed a weapon, and that weapon came in the form of a man named Johannan Vigoda. Vigoda was not a typical entertainment lawyer. He did not wear the sharp shark-skin suits of the Detroit establishment. He was an eccentric, a counterculture figure who later became known for wearing sandals to boardroom meetings and speaking in riddles. But beneath the bohemian exterior was a legal mind of terrifying precision. Vigoda looked at the Motown contract not as a binding agreement, but as a catalog of vulnerabilities. The two men met in secret. The dynamic was unprecedented. A blind black pop star and a white Jewish lawyer plotting the overthrow of the most powerful black-owned business in America. Vigoda confirmed what Stevie had suspected, the voidable nature of the contract. The law stated that an agreement signed by a minor could be disaffirmed upon reaching the age of majority. Motown knew this law existed, of course. Their entire business model relied on the assumption that the artist would be too scared, too dependent, or too financially entangled to exercise it. They banked on the psychological barrier, not the legal one. They assumed Stevie would need his allowance to survive. But Stevie had been watching. He had been listening. For 10 years, he had operated inside the machine. He knew where the wires were. He realized that to win this war, he didn't just need a lawyer. He needed to prove that he was the machine. Throughout 1970, he began to engage in a sophisticated form of corporate espionage. He started producing records for other artists on the label, including the Spinners. He wasn't doing this out of charity. He was doing it to learn the technical side of the business. He learned how to book studio time, how to manage engineers, how to budget a session, and how to mix a track. He was acquiring the means of production. Every hour he spent behind the mixing board was a rehearsal for his independence. At the same time, his personal life was shifting, creating another layer of distance between him and his handlers. In September 1970, he married Sarita Wright. This was a critical tactical move. Sarita was an insider. She worked at Motown, but she was loyal to Stevie. Marriage gave him a legal status of adulthood that further eroded his mother's, and by extension, Motown's guardianship. It allowed him to move out of the family home and into an apartment where he could talk freely without fear of being overheard by the tutors or the spies. Sarita became his lyricist, his confidant, and his co-conspirator. Together, they began writing songs that were miles away from the boy meets girl formula. They wrote about spiritual seeking, about Vietnam, about the crushing pressure of expectations. Until this point, synthesizers were largely seen as cold scientific instruments used for avant-garde noise or sci-fi soundtracks. They were the size of telephone switchboards and required a scientist to operate. But Stevie met two engineers, Malcolm Cecil and Robert Margouleff, who had built a massive custom synthesizer called Tonto. When Stevie touched the keys of Tonto, he didn't just hear a sound, he heard the future. He realized he could replace the entire Motown orchestra, the strings, the horns, the session players, with a single keyboard. This was the final key to the prison door. If he could play every instrument himself, he didn't need the Funk Brothers. He didn't need the Motown production line. He could carry an entire symphony in his head and output it through his hands. Motown hated the synthesizer. They thought it sounded robotic and unsoulful. When Stevie mentioned wanting to experiment with electronic sounds, the executives laughed him off. They told him to stick to the piano and the harmonica. They told him not to ruin his sound. This rejection was the final insult. It proved that Motown wasn't just stealing his money, they were stifling his evolution. It solidified his resolve. He stopped talking to them about his new music. He simply recorded it, put the tapes in a box, and hid them. He was building a stockpile of ammunition. As the calendar turned to 1971, the tension inside the Stevie Wonder camp became suffocating. The date, May 13th, loomed like a cliff edge. Motown began the standard procedure for a contract renewal. They prepared the paperwork, which offered a modest royalty increase and a continuation of the same controlling terms. They prepared the press releases celebrating the continuation of the partnership. They had no idea that their calls were being screened by Johann and Vigoda. They had no idea that Stevie had already drafted a declaration of independence. The deception required during these final months was immense. Stevie had to walk into the Motown offices, shake hands with the men who were robbing him, and pretend to be the good son. He had to perform his old hits on stage with a smile, while his mind was racing with the complex polyrhythmic funk of the secret tapes he was hiding in New York. He was living a double life. To the public, he was the smiling superstar. To his inner circle, he was the leader of a heist crew, waiting for the signal to blow the vault. The fatal weakness that Motown had projected onto him, his blindness, became his ultimate camouflage. Because he couldn't see them, they assumed he couldn't see through them. Because he was quiet, they assumed he was content. They saw a disabled boy who needed their protection. They failed to see the 20-year-old man who had memorized every clause of his servitude and was counting the seconds until he could burn the paper that held him. The trap was set. The birthday cake was ordered, and the boy in the dark glasses was ready to light the fuse. As the winter of 1970 thawed into the spring of 1971, the atmosphere inside the Motown empire was one of business as usual. The assembly line was humming. The records were selling. The executives in the plush offices on West Grand Boulevard looked at their quarterly projections and saw no cause for alarm. They looked at Stevie Wonder, now a 20-year-old veteran of the industry, and saw a compliant, profitable asset. He was releasing hits like Signed, Sealed, Delivered, I'm Yours, a song whose very title seemed to confirm his loyalty to the brand. He was smiling for the cameras. He was showing up on time. To the overlords of Detroit, the rebellious phase of his teenage years seemed to have evaporated. They believed they had successfully domesticated the Prodigy. They believed the golden cage was secure. They were spectacularly wrong. What they interpreted as compliance was, in fact, the discipline of a spy operating behind enemy lines. Stevie Wonder had not accepted his fate. He had simply gone underground. He realized that open defiance, the arguments, the tantrums, the refusal to record, was a child's tactic. To defeat a corporation as powerful as Motown, he needed to think like a corporation. He needed a strategy that was cold, legalistic, and ruthless. And for that, he needed a consigliere. Enter Johann Vigoda. If you were casting a movie about the music industry in 1971, Vigoda would be the character the audience refused to believe was real. He was a white Jewish lawyer from New York who looked more like a beatnik poet than a corporate shark. He wore dashikis to boardroom meetings. He wore sandals. He had a beard that made him look like a biblical prophet who had taken a wrong turn into a law library. But beneath the eccentric exterior lay a legal mind of terrifying precision. Vigoda did not care about the glamour of Motown. He was not intimidated by Berry Gordy. He looked at the contract Lula Mae Hardaway had signed 10 years earlier, and he didn't see a binding agreement. He saw a catalog of vulnerabilities. The meetings between Stevie and Vigoda were conducted in total secrecy. The stakes were incredibly high. If Motown had caught wind of what they were plotting, the retaliation would have been swift. The label could have frozen Stevie's accounts, filed preemptive injunctions to block him from recording, or launched a smear campaign to destroy his reputation before he could make his move. So they operated in the shadows. Vigoda explained the nuclear option to Stevie, the law of disaffirmance. Under the statutes of both Michigan and California, a contract signed by a minor was not a permanent shackle. It was voidable. The law recognized that a child lacked the capacity to bind themselves to a lifetime of servitude. This meant that on the precise stroke of midnight on his 21st birthday, Stevie had a one-time window to wipe the slate clean. He could legally declare that the previous 10 years of agreements, the low royalties, the control, the ownership of his masters, were null and void. But Vigoda warned him, the law helps those who help themselves. Motown would not hand over his freedom. He would have to take it. And to take it, he needed leverage. Legal freedom was useless if he was broke. This brings us to the centerpiece of the plot, the trust fund. For a decade, Motown had been withholding Stevie's earnings, accumulating millions of dollars in a restricted account, claiming they were protecting him. They used this money as a leash. They assumed that A 21-year-old boy suddenly given access to a fortune would do what most child stars did, blow it on cars, drugs, and bad investments, and then come crawling back to the label for a refill. They banked on his financial immaturity. Stevie and Vigoda planned to weaponize that assumption. They decided they wouldn't just leave Motown, they would take Motown's own money and use it to finance a war against them. The countdown began. As May 13, 1971 approached, the deception required from Stevie was immense. He had to walk the halls of Hitsville, USA, shake hands with the men who were robbing him, and pretend to be the good son. He had to suppress the simmering rage of a decade of exploitation. He had to suppress the new music exploding in his head, the synthesizers, the funk, the political lyrics, and continue to sing the pop songs they handed him. It was a performance of Trojan horse proportions. He was smiling at the gatekeepers while holding the dynamite behind his back. Then came the day. May 13, 1971, the 21st birthday. In the executive suites of Motown, there was a celebratory, almost arrogant mood. They had prepared the standard renewal paperwork. They had the cake. They expected a negotiation, perhaps a request for a higher advance or a better tour bus. But ultimately, they expected Stevie to sign. He was family. He was their creation. Where else would he go? Who else would take care of a blind man? Instead of a signature, they received a process server. Stevie delivered a formal legal notice drafted by Vigoda. It was cold, unambiguous, and devastating. It stated that Stevlin Morris was hereby disaffirming all prior agreements with Motown Records. It declared that he was now a free agent. He was no longer an employee of the company. And then came the demand that stopped the hearts of the accounting department. Stevie demanded the immediate liquidation and payout of his trust fund. He didn't want an allowance. He didn't want a stipend. He wanted every single cent of the millions he had earned since he was 11 years old. And he wanted it now. The shock at Motown was seismic. Berry Gordy, the man who prided himself on his total control over his artists, was blindsided. He had lost his little Stevie. The initial reaction was a mix of disbelief and fury. There were shouts of betrayal. There were emotional appeals to loyalty. "We made you," they cried. "We took you out of the projects. We were your family when no one else wanted you." But Stevie was unmoved. The family argument holds no weight when the father has been stealing from the son for 10 years. The debt was paid. He took his check, a sum hovering around $1 million, an absolute fortune in 1971, and he walked out the door. This is the moment the narrative shifts from a story of exploitation to a story of corporate warfare. A typical 21-year-old with $1 million might have bought a fleet of Cadillacs or a mansion in the Hollywood Hills. Stevie did not do that. He understood that capital is power. He took the money, Motown's money, and reinvested it into his own independence. He retreated to New York City, renting a hotel suite and booking hundreds of hours at Media Sound Studios. This was a calculated, strategic move. By going to New York, he physically removed himself from the orbit of Detroit. He cut the cord, and by booking his own studio time, paying the engineers out of his own pocket, he seized the means of production. For the first time in his life, he didn't have to ask permission to turn on a microphone. He didn't have to wait for a producer to approve a take. He was the employer. In these independent sessions, Stevie unleashed the music he had been hiding. He worked with engineers Malcolm Cecil and Robert Margouleff to master the Tonto synthesizer. He was creating a sound that was dense, electronic, funky, and radically different from the polished pop of Motown. He was building an arsenal. These tapes were his leverage. He knew that eventually Motown would come calling. And when they did, he wanted to be able to say, "I don't need you to make records. I can make them myself. The only thing I need you for is to put them in stores, and if you won't do it, someone else will." Motown watched this from afar with growing dread. They realized they had made a catastrophic error. They had let their most talented artist walk away with a war chest of cash. The industry was buzzing with rumors. Would Stevie sign with CBS? Would he go to Atlantic? If Motown lost Stevie Wonder, it would signal the end of their dominance. It would be a public relations disaster and a financial bloodbath. They realized with a sinking feeling that they had no choice. They had to get him back. But when they reached out to reopen negotiations, they found the door barred by Johann Vigoda. The dynamic had completely inverted. Motown was no longer dictating terms to a confused mother and a blind child. They were negotiating with a wealthy, independent CEO who happened to be a musical genius. The negotiation that followed was brutal. It was a siege. Vigoda fought for every clause, every percentage point, every comma. He wasn't just asking for a raise, he was asking for a restructuring of the entire artist-label relationship. Motown tried to push back. They tried to retain the rights to the publishing. They tried to keep the quality control clause that allowed them to veto songs. Vigoda held the line. He told them point blank, Stevie doesn't need Motown, Motown needs Stevie. Stevie even floated the idea that he might retire from music altogether or move to Africa to work on humanitarian causes. It was a brilliant bluff or perhaps a sincere threat. It didn't matter. It terrified Motown. The prospect of the Golden Goose retiring at 21 was a nightmare scenario. They crumbled. The result of this high-stakes game of chicken was a document that became legendary in the annals of entertainment law, a contract that ran to 120 pages. To put that in perspective, the standard recording contract of the era was often 4 or 5 pages long. This was not a contract, it was a constitution. Let us parse the terms of this victory, because they represent the total dismantling of the slavery system Stevie had grown up in. First, the money. Stevie secured a royalty rate of approximately 14% of the retail price of his records. In 1971, the industry standard for a black artist was often less than 3%, and even superstars rarely saw above 5% or 8%. Stevie didn't just break the ceiling, he shattered it. He became the highest paid artist in the history of the company, instantly correcting the decade of underpayment. Second, the ownership. The contract granted him his own publishing company. This meant that every time his songs were played on the radio, covered by another artist, or used in a film, the money went to him, not to Motown's publishing arm. He also secured ownership of his master recordings, the holy grail of the music business. He wasn't just renting his voice anymore. He owned the tapes. But the third victory was the one that mattered most. It was the clause that Vigoda and Stevie had fought for with the ferocity of wolves: total creative control. The contract stipulated in legally binding language that Motown Records had no right to interfere with the artistic process of Stevie Wonder. No more quality control meetings. No more Berry Gordy voting up or down on a song. No more producers telling him to keep it simple. Motown was forbidden from changing a single note, a single lyric, or even the artwork of the album cover without Stevie's written permission. Their role was reduced to that of a logistics company. They manufactured the vinyl and shipped it to the stores. That was it. The content inside the groove was the exclusive domain of Stevie Wonder. When the ink dried on those 120 pages in 1972, the revolution was complete. The little boy who had been paraded around as a freak show, the monkey who had been forced to dance for his allowance, had successfully staged a hostile takeover of his own destiny. He had used the white man's law and the black man's money to force the system to its knees. The executives at Motown looked at the document and knew that the era of the hit factory was over. They could no longer treat artists like interchangeable parts in a machine. Stevie Wonder had proven that the artist was the machine. Armed with this contract, Stevie retreated back into the studio. But this time, he wasn't sneaking in. He walked in through the front door, and for the first time in his life, no one stopped him to ask what he was doing. He sat down at the synthesizer, put on his headphones, and prepared to record the sound of his freedom. The world was about to hear Music of My Mind, Talking Book, and Inner Visions. But before a single note of those masterpieces was played, the greatest masterpiece had already been written. It wasn't a song. It was a 120-page legal document that said, for the first time in the history of American music, the genius is in charge. With the ink dry on the 120-page constitution of his freedom, Stevie Wonder did not immediately run to the press. He did not launch a victory tour. He did something far more radical. He disappeared. For the first time in his life, the clock was his own. There were no tour managers banging on his hotel door, no producers checking their watches, no frantic schedule of singles to be churned out for the radio. He retreated into the studio, specifically Electric Lady Studios in New York and later the record plant in Los Angeles, and he locked the door. What happened inside those soundproof rooms between 1972 and 1976 was not just a recording session, it was a metamorphosis. To understand the sonic revolution that was about to take place, we must first appreciate the risk he was taking. The public knew Stevie Wonder as the boy genius of Motown, a purveyor of polished, upbeat, orchestral pop. They expected horns, strings, and happy lyrics about teenage romance. What Stevie was building in the dark was a complete repudiation of that sound. He was stripping away the orchestra. He was firing the session musicians. He was dismantling the Motown sound brick by brick and replacing it with electricity. The primary weapon of this revolution was the synthesizer. Until this moment, instruments like the Moog and the ARP were largely viewed by the serious music establishment as gimmicks. They were used for sci-fi movie sound effects or novelty records, cold, robotic, and soulless. The idea of using a machine to play soul music, a genre defined by human emotion, breath, and grit, was considered a contradiction in terms. But Stevie saw something in the machine that no one else saw. He saw a mirror of his own experience. As a blind man, he had navigated a world of vibrations and frequencies his entire life. The synthesizer was simply a device that allowed him to manipulate those frequencies directly. He partnered with engineers Malcolm Cecil and Robert Margouleff to tame the massive Tonto system, the original new timbral orchestra. This was not a keyboard you could buy at a music store. It was a monolithic, curved wall of wood and wires, standing 6 feet high and 20 feet wide, looking more like the cockpit of a spacecraft than a musical instrument. It was a beast that had to be physically wrestled with. Stevie would spend hours, sometimes days, patching cables and twisting knobs to create a single sound. He wasn't looking for a trumpet sound or a violin sound. He was sculpting texture. He created bass lines that didn't just hum. They squelched and growled like living creatures. He created layers of synthetic strings that sounded like a choir of ghosts. He was painting with sound, and for the first time, he was using his own palette. When Music of My Mind was released in early 1972, it was a shock to the system. The critics were baffled. The album credits were a testament to his total control. Produced by Stevie Wonder, arranged by Stevie Wonder, vocals, drums, piano, organ, clavinet, moog bass by Stevie Wonder. He had become a one-man band, but not in the novelty sense of the busker on the corner. He had become an architect. He was constructing entire symphonies in his head and outputting them through his fingertips. The little boy, who'd been led around by the hand, was gone. In his place was a musical scientist, but music of my mind was just the prototype. The true explosion occurred later that year with Talking Book. This album contained the track that would define his new identity, Superstition. Listen to the opening riff of that song. It is played on a Hohner clavinet, an electric keyboard, but it sounds like a swamp. It is gritty, funky, and incredibly aggressive. It is the sound of a man who is no longer asking for permission. Motown in the old days would have polished that sound. They would have added a string section to sweeten it. They would have told him to simplify the rhythm. But under the new contract, Motown could do nothing but press the vinyl and ship it. The song went to number 1. It proved that Stevie's instincts were sharper than a boardroom full of executives. It proved that the public was ready for a black artist who was complex, dark, and uncompromising. With his commercial power cemented, Stevie turned his gaze to the third pillar of his liberation, social reality. This is where the break from Motown was most violent. For a decade, he had been forced to sing about sugar and spice while his country was burning. Now, with the release of Inner Visions in 1973, he ripped the blinders off his audience. He stopped singing about the world as Motown wanted it to be and started singing about the world as it was. Consider the track Living for the City. This was not a pop song. It was a 7-minute audio documentary. It told the story of a young black man migrating from Mississippi to New York City, hoping for a better life, only to be chewed up by the systemic racism of the North. The song features a spoken word interlude, a piece of cinema for the ears, complete with the sounds of grimy bus engines, police sirens, racial slurs, and the slamming of a prison cell door. It was raw, ugly, and terrifying. It forced the suburban white teenager, listening in their bedroom, to experience the visceral reality of the black inner city. This was the ultimate rejection of the freak show. Motown had spent years trying to make Stevie non-threatening. With Inner Visions, he became dangerous. He became a mirror reflecting the cracks in the American dream. He didn't stop at racism. He went after the President of the United States. In 1974, with the Watergate scandal swirling, Stevie released You Haven't Done Nothin'. It was a direct, funk-fueled attack on Richard Nixon. The lyrics were scathing. We are amazed but not amused, / by all the things you say that you'll do. He invited the Jackson 5, the crowning jewels of the Motown pop machine, to sing backing vocals on the track, effectively co-opting the label's safe brand to deliver a revolutionary message. It was a masterstroke of irony. He was using the tools of the pop industry to dismantle political authority. This period, stretching from 1972 to 1976, is often called the classic period. It culminated in the release of Songs in the Key of Life, a double album that is widely considered his magnum opus. The mere existence of this album was a flex of his contractual power. He made the world wait 2 years a bit, an eternity in the 1970s music business. He recorded hundreds of songs, discarding hits that other artists would have killed for simply because they didn't fit his vision. When it was finally released, it debuted at number 1. It was a sprawling, joyous, complex tapestry of life, covering everything from the birth of his daughter to the history of music to the poverty of the ghetto. It was the final, undeniable proof that the gamble of 1971 had paid off. The artist knew best, But the legacy of the 1971 rebellion extends far beyond the discography. We must look at the long tail of that victory to understand its true weight. By winning his freedom, Stevie Wonder shattered the paternalistic model of the music industry. Before him, the prevailing wisdom was that black artists needed white handlers, or at least corporate handlers, to manage their careers, their money, and their image. Stevie proved that a black artist could be the CEO, the producer, the songwriter, and the visionary all at once. He laid the blueprint for every artist who would fight for ownership decades later. Every modern star who demands control of their masters today is walking through a door that Stevie Wonder kicked open with his 120-page contract. Moreover, this newfound autonomy allowed him to transition from a pop star to a political force. Because he owned his voice, he could use it for causes that the corporate world deemed too controversial. In the late 1970s, he became the driving force behind the campaign to establish a national holiday for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He didn't just give money. He paused his career. He wrote Happy Birthday, a song that was explicitly designed to be a propaganda tool for the movement. He organized rallies. He lobbied Congress. Motown, in its 1960s incarnation, would likely have forbidden this, fearing it would alienate white record buyers in the South. But the post-1971 Stevie Wonder answered to no one. The result was federal law. The holiday we celebrate today exists in large part because a musician had the legal and financial freedom to fight for it. He took this same energy to the global stage, becoming a fierce opponent of apartheid in South Africa. In 1985, he accepted an Oscar for I Just Called to Say I Love You and dedicated it to Nelson Mandela, who was then still in prison. The South African government immediately banned his music. A weaker artist, beholden to a nervous record label, might have apologized to protect their sales in that market. Stevie wore the ban as a badge of honor. He had reached a level of power where he could punish nations with his silence. We began this journey standing at a crime scene. We presented you with a victim, Steveland Morris, a blind child born into poverty, placed in an incubator that burned his eyes and then placed in a contract that burned his future. We identified the perpetrator, a corporate machine that viewed him not as a human being, but as a depreciating asset, a wonder to be sold until the novelty wore off. And we showed you the weapon, the 1961 contract, signed by a mother who couldn't read the fine print, which legally stripped a genius of his own voice. At the beginning of this film, we asked a question. How did the victim become the judge, jury, and executioner? Now, after examining the evidence of 20 years, the answer is clear. Stevie Wonder didn't just win a negotiation. He pulled off the greatest magic trick in the history of the entertainment industry. He let Motown believe they were watching him while in reality he was watching them. He used his silence as a weapon. He used his disability as a cloak of invisibility. While they were busy managing the Little Boy Blue, he was busy becoming the CEO of his own destiny. The heist of 1971 was not a theft of money. It was a theft of power. He stole back the one thing the industry tries to hoard for itself, autonomy. To fully appreciate the magnitude of this victory, we must understand what Stevie destroyed. Motown Records was not just a label, it was a factory of dreams. But it was a factory built on a plantation model. The genius of Berry Gordy was that he created a system where black artists could become stars, provided they acted, dressed, and sang exactly how he told them to. It was a golden cage. It was comfortable. It was profitable, but it was locked. Stevie Wonder was the first prisoner to realize that the bars were made of glass. He realized that the only thing keeping him inside was the belief that he couldn't survive outside. By walking out the door with his trust fund and his master tapes, he didn't just free himself, he shattered the myth of the benevolent dictator. He proved that the artist does not need the machine. The artist is the machine. This realization is the core of his greatness. It is easy to be distracted by the 25 Grammys. It is easy to be blinded by the sheer brilliance of Superstition or Sir Duke. But if you strip away the music, you are left with something even more impressive, a business case study. Stevie Wonder was the first black artist in the 20th century to achieve true vertical integration. He owned the song through his publishing. He owned the sound through his masters. He owned the image through his creative control. In an era where black men were routinely excluded from the boardroom, Stevie Wonder built his own boardroom in the studio and invited the executives to visit him as guests. The ripples of the 1971 rebellion are still being felt today. Stevie Wonder didn't just secure a future for himself, he drafted a blueprint for every artist who came after him. Look at Prince in the 1990s, when he wrote "Slave" on his cheek and changed his name to a symbol to protest his record label. He was fighting the war that Stevie declared. Look at Michael Jackson. When he shrewdly purchased the Beatles' publishing catalog, understanding that ownership is wealth, he was applying the lessons taught by Stevie. Look at the modern era, from Kanye West demanding his masters to Taylor Swift re-recording her albums to regain control. Every single one of these battles is a footnote to the 120-page Constitution that Johannan Vigoda and Stevie Wonder slapped onto Berry Gordy's desk. Stevie showed them that the music industry is designed to keep you a child. It gives you an allowance. It gives you a bedtime. It tells you what to wear. The only way to become a man or a woman in this business is to be willing to walk away from the table, to be willing to disappear into a hotel room in New York with nothing but a synthesizer and a belief in yourself. As we close the file on this story, we must reconsider the concept of vision. For the first decade of his life, the world defined Stevie Wonder by what he lacked. They called him blind. They pitied him living in the dark. But the story we have told proves that Stevie Wonder had better eyesight than anyone at Motown. Berry Gordy had sight. He saw a little boy playing a harmonica. The critics had sight. They saw a novelty act. Stevie Wonder had vision. He saw a future where a synthesizer could have a soul. He saw a future where a pop song could bring down a president. He saw a future where a black man could stand on the stage of the United Nations, not as an entertainer, but as a leader. He saw the invisible wires that controlled him, and he saw exactly where to cut them. The little boy who was led onto the stage by handlers is long dead. He died in that hotel room in 1971. In his place stands a titan, a man who taught us that true independence is not given, it is seized. Stevie Wonder's life is the ultimate proof that while you can blind a man, you can never ever trap a wonder. The crime scene is cleared. The victim has become the victor, and the song belongs to him.